I'm Mark Franks. I'm the platform evangelist for Acumatica. I host these series. The Web Services Basic REST API is today, and tomorrow we'll cover OData. This is Samuel Olivier Leveguer, who's one of our software developers. If you've been around Acumatica for a while, I'm sure you've seen his presentations that we do at the summit, and he again will be doing a presentation on web services at the summit this year in our track for developers. So with that, Samuel, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Perfect, Frank. Thank you for the introduction. So hi everyone. As Mark said, my name is Samuel, and I'll be presenting you today the web service basics focused on the REST API. So on our agenda today, first I'll be talking about the web service. I'll cover it mostly in slides, and then I'll do a small demo. Then I'll cover how the license you have in Acumatica can affect the web service. Then some small change that are happening to our web service in 19R2. Then I'll just give you a couple of resources where you can get more information about our web service, and then I'll be here for a small period of questions. So without further ado, let's start. So in Acumatica, we have multiple web service. We have the screen-based web service that is based on the technology SOAP. We have the contract base that is also SOAP, but the contract base can also be REST, which is what I'll be talking more today. And we also have, in a similar manner, we have OData that, as Mark mentioned, will be covered by one of my colleagues in another webinar tomorrow. So the contract-based web service is based upon endpoints that are definitions of the screens that are present in Acumatica in the form of entities that have fields. With Acumatica, out of the box, you have default endpoints that have screens that are pre-mapped with fields that are mostly used, the field that are mostly used in these screens. If, for example, you do not find the screens or the fields that you want to interact with for a web service, it is possible to extend these endpoints or to create some of your own in order to further or to complete, let's say, your integration. And if once you have extended these endpoints, of course, they are not part of Acumatica out of the box. There is easy ways to export and import them through other websites. Okay, so now if we jump on the request types that are available. So for example, in the post category of request type, we have the logins and the logout that have this following structure. So you'll have your Acumatica ERP instance URL, followed by the keyword entity, the auth keyword, and then either login or logout. And you also have the possibility of executing actions on specific screens or specific entities with the post request. The get request is, of course, to retrieve records. You can retrieve either single records or list of records. The put request is to either create a record or update one. And you have the delete request that is for delete, of course, deleting a record. Most of the time for the get, the put, and the delete, the start of the URL for the request will be your Acumatica ERP instance URL, followed once again by the entity keyword, the name of the endpoint, the version of the endpoint, and the name of the entity, which is the screen. So for example, in the case of the sales order screen, the entity name is called sales order, so it would be default endpoint, the version of the endpoint, and then followed by the sales order keyword. So for these different type of requests, you have different parameters that are available to you. You have the filter that allows you to restrict the amount of records that you want to retrieve depending on specific parameters. You have the top and skip that allows you to do pagination. So for example, you only want to retrieve the first 10 records, and then you want the records 11 to 20. You can use top and skip. You have the expand that will allow you to expand a subsection of the screen that are defined in like sub-entities that I'll be showing a bit later in the endpoint. You have the select parameter that allows you to retrieve only specific fields. So for example, if you do not specify this parameter, all the fields that are defined in that entity will be returned. But if you do specify it, it will reduce the amount of data being returned and only return you these fields. And you also have the custom parameter that will allow you to retrieve fields that are not present on the screen, but that you haven't added yet to an endpoint. If you have like one additional field only and you don't feel like extending a whole endpoint and maintaining it, this parameter can be used in order to do this. Okay, so now if we want to cover accessing custom fields and screens, how to retrieve custom fields that are not present on the endpoint, you can basically retrieve the it depends on the two different scenarios. If these fields are present in new screen, when I say new screen is a screen that is not present yet in the endpoint, you will have to add that screen to the endpoint in the form of an entity, and then you will be able to add these fields to that screen, either using the grid or a populate action that I will be displaying in the demo further along. Or if it's fields that are present on the screen or and not visible, for example, the last modified date time, you can add them directly to an endpoint, or you can use the custom parameter that I talked about a bit earlier. So if we now jump to the demo using Postman, I'll be displaying it. I'll make this a bit bigger. So we see here that I have my post request that will be taking care of the login with inside of the body, the name that's for username, the password that's for the password. If we had a company, we could have it mentioned, or tenant, we could have it mentioned a bit lower than this. If we had more than one, I only have one, so I do not need to mention it. So I will be logging in. Okay, I have the status 204 no content, which means I have successfully logged in. Then I can proceed with the different requests. So in order to get a record, you can use, there's multiple methods that you can use. You can, use the key fields of the screen in the URL itself as like additional parameters, additional objects down the line. So we have sales, we have the base address of the site, the entity keyword, the name of the endpoint, the version of the endpoint, our entity, and then we have our key fields. If you only have one, only specify one. If you have to, you need to mention both. You can't just specify the order type. So in this case, if I send this request, in a short while, I should be getting back that specific order. Here we have it. So we have our order with all the fields that were defined inside. And now if I go here and I'll try to retrieve sales orders, but with, for example, parameters or without any parameters or even key fields. If I were to proceed this way, it would retrieve me the whole list of every single sales order present in the system, which might take a while, so I won't do it for now. I can use, as I mentioned a bit earlier, the filter parameter to retrieve pretty much the exact same order that I was using. So for example, I use filter order type equal SO and order number equal this order number. If I send this request, I once again have my sales order that has been retrieved. If I come here and instead of wanting to retrieve the whole list, I only want to retrieve the top 5, I only need to add this parameter. So here I will have an array in response, and if I collapse everything, I can see that I have 5 different sales orders being retrieved. And if we then, let's say we're done with retrieving the first 5, we want to retrieve the next 5. So then we keep the top 5 parameter and we add the skip. So then this will retrieve me the sales order in the system from the 6th to the 10th sales order in the system. Once again, with this request, we'll see that if I collapse it, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sales orders being retrieved. But let's say we want to retrieve a sales order, but we don't want to have like all the information. We're only interested in the description, the order number, and the order type. So if we use the select parameter and combine with the filter here at the top, we have a single sales order being returned, but it only has the description, the order number, and the order type field. So reduce a lot the amount of data being transferred through the system. For sure, this is a very small request, so the effect on it can be minimal. But for example, if you were to retrieve hundreds or thousands of orders, this could allow you to reduce the amount of time that is required to process all that information. In addition to this, if I want to, let's say, the last modified date time, if I remove the select field here and I retrieve once again my sales order, we'll see if we take a look that the last modified time can be found here, but in specific screen where it cannot be found, we could add it through the custom field parameter. So using this, we specify the name of the field and the view in which that field should be found. So in this case, the document is the main view of the sales order screen, and we specify the last modified date time. If we send this, it's being sent. I see that there's questions. I will be answering them near the end just to make sure that I have time to cover everything. If I go back now to see that the sales order retrieved, at the end we have a custom collection table where we see that we have our view document, our last modified date time, which is a custom date field time, and we have our value right here. Further down the available parameters, we have the expand parameter that allows us to access detail section of the endpoint. It's of the screen. For example, in this case, for the sales order, I will be accessing the detail part. So if I send a request like this, we will be able to see that around the alphabetical order for detailed, we now have the multiple details that are included in that specific sales order. I think I noticed that I did jump directly in the request. So now in order to further along this understanding of what entities this sub-entity, I'll just go and quickly show up the web service endpoint screen. So this is our web service endpoint screen, which comes with Acumatica and which shows you the endpoints that are defined in it out of the box. So you will have the default endpoint. It will have, at least in 19R2, these 3 versions. I always recommend that you use the most recent, in this case the 18.200. And in here in the tree view to the left, you can see this is the list of entities, or the list of all screens that are predefined with the default endpoint. So if we scroll down until the one I'm using, which is the sales order one, we'll see by opening it that this is the sales order entity, which has all of these fields defined in it. And these inside of here are what I like to call sub-entities that belong to the sales order. So these are entities that won't display by default, but you can extend use the expand parameter in order to make them display. So in this case, I was using the details subentity in order to display the sales order details, which, if I go to the sales order, corresponds to the document details, which is right here. If I wanted to, as I mentioned a bit earlier, let's say there's a field that I don't find on the screen and that I want to interact with, you can use the extend endpoint button right here that allows you to that shows you the endpoint name, endpoint version of the endpoint that you had selected. Then you can give a new name and a new version for the endpoint that will be the extension of the base one that you're using. Inside of this, once it's created, let's say I probably have my default plus that I always create, you will be able to see pretty much the same fields that are in the base endpoint, and same screen, same fields. And if there is a small arrow pointing down next to an entity, it means that it is unmodified from the base endpoint. So in this case, we can see account, activity, bill. All of these are coming from the base endpoint. Okay, if we jump back to Postman real quick. I did get the request in different ways. Let's close this for now. Don't save. So if we jump here in order to create a sales order. So in this case, it is a put request with the base address of the site, the entity keyword, default, endpoint name, endpoint version, and then the name of the entity. And inside of the body, the fields that are required in order to create the sales order itself. So in this case, I went for the most minimalistic possible request that could create a sales order. So I'm specifying the order type, the customer, a short description, and I'm adding 3 different details with only the inventory ID and the order quantity for each. So in this case, I can send this, and it should come back to me in a short while with all the fields in the sales order that are created. So okay, we have our sales order that is being returned with the list of details as we mentioned the details in here. So if I just scroll down to get the order number, to proceed. Order number was this one. Okay, so now that I have this newly created sales order, if I go to my sales order screen, we can see, of course, refresh it. You can see the order right here that has been created with this description. Now we'll be using, once again, put a request with the same URL, but with only specific parameters in order to update this sales order. So I'm specifying the 2 key fields in order to find the record. So the order type, the order number, and the fields, or in this case, field that I want to modify through this this request. So in this case, I will be changing the test for webinar description for tests for webinar by key field. So if I send this, we can see the description has changed right here and on the screen itself. Now there's 2 ways of updating records, either by using the key fields or by using the ID field. This is a system field that is defined by Acumatica for each and every record. So if we use this, we can, with once again the same request, just putting this ID field right here, and only this, if you're using the ID, only the ID is necessary in order to identify a record. So you can pass only the ID field and the field that you want to modify. In this case, the value, once again, for the description will be changed to test for webinar by ID. It has completed, so if we just scroll down, we can take a look that the description test for webinar by ID has changed. If we take a look at the screen, we'll be able to see the description change again. Okay, now that we have created and updated our sales order, it might be time to create a shipment for it. So in this case, we can use the post request in order to execute an action. Once again, the structure is the name of the site, entity keyword, name of the endpoint, version of the endpoint, name of the entity, and then name of the action. So in this case, if the parameter, the body should look something like this. We have two very specific sections, the entity section that is used in order to identify on which record to trigger this action. And if the action has any parameters, then we can use this parameter section in order to specify it. So for example, if I go back to the screen, if I were to click the create shipment, we can see that this action has parameters. In this case, I'm just re-specifying the warehouse ID to be the wholesale value right here. So I'll be just coming back here to take the ID that I had used in order to target it. Okay, and then if I trigger this action, we'll see that a different type of response is being received. We see the status 202 accepted, which means that the action has been accepted for the processing by Acumatica, but we don't know if it succeeded or not. In order to find the response for this, we can take a look in the headers for the response of this 202 result, and in the location header, we have this address right here that if we do a get status on, just copy this and remove the additional slash, we'll see that we get the 204 no content, which means it has successfully processed the request. If an error had been encountered, we would have seen the error message encountered by the action right here. Okay. Now we have the possibility of deleting sales orders, which once again, same structure, URL, entity, name of the endpoint, version of the endpoint, the name of the entity, but you need to use either the key fields in the address or the ID in the address in order to delete the records. In this case, if I go to my sales order, we see that it is now into a shipping status as we have executed the create action on it. I will delete the shipment in order to allow myself to delete this sales order through the request. So if I take this right here back to Postman, paste it right here and send this request, we have once again the status 204 no content. It means this request has been successfully processed, and if we try to cancel, we see that we are now bring back to a new order because that order does not exist anymore. So now let us go back quickly to our presentation. In order to deal with the web service, you need to authenticate yourself, but you are not obligated to authenticate yourself through a login request. you can use OAuth 2.0 authentication. The different mechanisms that are supported are authorization code, implicit method, and the resource owner password credentials. And I'll now go back to a quick demo about this through Postman. So in order to, I'll just log myself out first to make sure that I cannot do request anymore. For example, if I were to try and send a request, I am getting the message, you are not logged in. If now I want to do this request to retrieve this sales order, as I mentioned, I should have done it with this one, you are not logged in. But if I use the authorization tab, I can get myself a new access token. Well, in Postman, you have this small pop-up that shows up. Before this, I'll just go back in here to show you where you can configure the required information in order to then enter it inside of Postman. So we have a connected application screen here on which you will need to define an entry. So in my case, I just put Postman as a client name. I defined the method that the resource that I wanted to have, which in my case was resource owner password credentials. And I added myself a shared secret. Just a small warning to all of you. Once you create a secret, once you add a secret, you will have a small pop-up that displays it. You can have a description for it, an expiry date. If you don't specify it, it won't expire. And you also have the value of the secret. Please take care of copying it or saving it in any way you want, because once you click OK, unless you put it like in the description, which I don't recommend unless for testing, you will not be able to find it again. In my case, this is my secret. This is my client ID. This client ID is generated when I save the record the first time. And now if we go back to Postman, okay, I have a name for the token that will be retrieved. I specified the type. In my case, it's password credential. This is the address needed to be targeted in order to retrieve a token. So the base is very similar. We have the base URL, but it is identity, connect, and token. We have my username, my password, the client ID that I just showed you, the client's secret, and here we have scope. There's multiple scopes that you can define for that token, but the API one, if you want to add more, you can add more just by separating them with a space in between them, but the API one is always required. So now if we just go ahead and request a token, we have it right here. If we use it, we can send this request that had previously failed. Authorization, and we have a successful retrieval of the sales order that was right here. There is a second method available in order to retrieve a token, which is without using the authorization tab in Postman. You can do the request yourself. It is a post request to the same address, the identity connect token, and in the body, in the XWW, that form.url encoded type, you can enter these parameters, which in this case we have the grant type, which is the password, because I'm using password credential, client ID with the value, client secret, username, password, and scope. Here I have API. This is another scope that's available. And if I send this request, I can see here that I get my token back in this format. I can then use it in the, sorry, I can use it, sorry, I have a small blank. We can use it in these type of requests by specifying it in the header, as I think you specify authorization here and bearer with the value of the token right here. Okay, if we quickly go back to our presentation, if in your process of dealing with our web service, at some point in time you might see errors that are specifying like optimization issues or optimization could not be performed due to BQL delegates. If when the optimization is possible, you can use the get method to retrieve a list of records and expanding the parent, sub-entity for all of them. If the optimization is not possible, you will need to use the get method to retrieve the records and then retrieve the details. For example, in this case, I'm just using sales order again, but it works with sales order, so there is no need to worry about this. But you can retrieve a list of sales orders, each with its list of details expanded. But on some specific request, you might get that error telling you that it's not working. In this case, you need to retrieve the list of sales order and then using the key fields at the top or the ID field, retrieve sales order one at a time with the details that you want. Well, the details will be a list, but it will be for a single sales order one at a time. One thing I wanted to mention additionally in this that I'll touch a bit more later is that previously it was only possible to retrieve a single detail if you were retrieving a list of records, and in 2019 R2 it's now possible to retrieve more than one detail, once again if the optimization is, if there is no BQL delegates involved in these details. So now in order to deal with file attachments, so in order to attach a file, we have our base endpoint URL that I'll be displaying a bit later. The top level entity, so in our case could be sales order. We have our first key value, our second key value. We have the keyword file and then the file name, and the content of the file would be in the body of the request. So here I have the definition for base endpoint URL, which is, as I've been mentioning since from the start, the Acumatica ERP instance URL, the entity keyword, endpoint name, and endpoint version. If you want to retrieve a file, then it is the base endpoint URL / files, and then the file identifier that you can retrieve from a specific record. So if I go back to Postman, in order to shortly demo this, I'll be creating myself a sales order that I have. Oh, I need to log myself back in. Let's create myself a sales order again. Okay, so now if I scroll to the bottom to retrieve my order number in order to attach a file to it. So if I were to take this request here, okay, so I have, as I mentioned during the presentation, the base URL for this. And in my body, in a binary format, I have added this file, which is just an image of an Acumatica email signature. And if I were to send it, we would have the 204 no content telling us that the image has been successfully attached to the record. So we had here created our sales order with the put request, and it had no file attached. If I were to retrieve this sales order again using the key fields at the top, one once it's done. Okay. If I scroll to the bottom, we'll be able to see now that in the files we have a value. This ID here is the file identifier that I was talking about when you want to retrieve the file. So for example, if I pull up my get file request, base address is the same, so URL, entity, default name, endpoint version / files this time, and now we have the ID file identifier right here that we have just retrieved. Here we have our, it's an image. It's not in a very pretty format, but please believe me, it is the image that we had previously sent. Okay, let us continue as we are nearing the end. So if we take part in the talk about the license limitation that can affect your web service integration. There is 3 different limitations: the maximum number of web service API user, the maximum number of concurrent web service API requests, and the maximum number of web service API requests per minute. The first of the 3 is represents the maximum number of API users that can be connected or logged in the system at the same time. So this is I will take this moment to just warn you. Once you're done with your request, please do not forget to log out. If you do not log out, then you might lock out further requests down the line. The maximum number of concurrent web service API requests, it's the maximum number of requests that can be executed simultaneously. If you have already reached that limit, there is a queue, so the request will not be denied immediately. It will be put in the queue in order to execute once one of the free spots for these concurrent web service API requests is free. And we have the maximum number of web service API requests per minute that represents, as it's pretty explicit, the amount that you can do per minute. Every single request counts toward that limit. Every login, every get, every put, every post, everything counts, so please take that into account. And if you encounter an error regarding these, the error code for these errors is the error code 429. You can find more information about these limitations on the license monitoring console screens and see like the amount of requests that might have been denied due to the license here. And a most common error that will be shown is the API login limit, which is a result of the first limitation. Okay, now if we jump to the small change that happened with the contract-based API within 2019 R2. So as I mentioned when I was talking about the login, if we had a company, or now they're called tenants, previously the way to mention them in the login request was using a company parameter. Now we have added the possibility to use the tenant like parameter or keyword in order for you to specify it. So in here you could add, before it was the company and then the name of the company. Now you can use the tenant, which is closer to the structure that Acumatica is following. The company keyword is still supported. The only warning I have to give you is that you cannot have a company and a tenant keyword at the same time. You need to choose one. So if you are developing a new solution, please use the tenant keyword as it's the new one. For those that already had solutions, the company one is still supported, but you can change it for the tenant keyword. Okay, now due to popular request in a way to retrieve the version of Acumatica and the endpoint list through the web service, there's a method that allows you to do so right now. That method is very simply the base URL of the site and only the entity keyword. So if you were to send this, you would be able to retrieve the version of the site, both the build version and the database version, and a list of endpoints right here. So we can see right now that we see a list of all the endpoints that are in the system. This request can be made without having logged in. If I just find my logout request. But if you do it without having logged in, you will have the version of the site, but you will only have the endpoints that come with Acumatica out of the box. No custom or no extended endpoints will be displayed. Okay, next change. Okay, as I mentioned a bit earlier during the optimization issue, previously, if you were to retrieve a list of records, it was only allowed to retrieve a single detail type entity. So a single like grid type of information. Now, as of 2019 R2, it is possible to retrieve more than one. So as many as you want, as long as there is no BQL delegates involved in each of them. Okay, and do we have time? Okay, yeah, we do have time. Okay, so let me just, I will be logging into a website of 19R1 very quickly, just to demonstrate the request for, okay. So if I were to try and retrieve a list of sales order with each, like the details and shipment detail type entities with them, I will get an error back telling me that that optimization does not allow this. So more than one detail property have been used in the request. Only one can be requested. But if we try to do the same thing in 2019 R2, have my get request with parameter right here. I use this expand right here and the top 5. We can see that these were returned. We have, at least for our first sales order, we have the list of details right here. And if we scroll back down, we have the list of details, both of which are arrays. In this case, there's only one for these, for each of these, but they are arrays, and you can retrieve as much as you want. And last change that happened, the ID field that is generated by the system previously in Acumatica version 19R1 and previous versions, this ID field was session specific. So for example, each time you logged in and retrieved a record, it would be attributed a single ID or GUID value, and that value would be valid only for the duration of the session. So once you logged out and logged back in, that session ID would no longer be valid. As of 2019 R2 though, this ID field is now persistent for all top-level entities and is based on the note ID field. So for example, if I were to come back to my to my record right here, and I can see that this ID here is, well, it starts with 211 C3B2. If I were to no, that is a login. Where is my logout? So here is my logout. If I log out and log back in, here, if I do the request again, we see that the ID has not changed and can be used to identify records through multiple sessions. Okay, now we are reaching the end of this presentation, and here is some different resources that you can use in order to find more information about this, about our web service that are available. So we have our help.acumatica.com website. We have the Acumatica University at openuni.acumatica.com. And we have a tag, an Acumatica tag at Stack Overflow. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them there, or feel free to search to see if someone else has asked that question before in order to answer it. Now, I am reaching the question part. If there is any question in the Q&A that have not been answered, I will do my best, and feel free to ask. Okay, so someone asked, can we sort how we want to retrieve ascendant or descendant based on weather fields? It is not currently possible to define an order that you want to retrieve the records in. If you want a specific order, I would recommend that you use the generic inquiries, specify your order there, and then use the web service in order to retrieve information from that generic inquiry so that the order is respected. Another question, can you please explain the top filter is based on what? I am unsure as to what the question is. It the top parameter or the filter parameter? Because if it's the top parameter, then it is the, like in the list, if you were to retrieve the, okay, thank you for specifying it. So if you were to retrieve the whole list of sales orders, then it is being returned in a specific order. If you specify the top, it will take the topmost parameter, so from the top of the list. So the top 10, it will take the first 10 in the list. It's similar to what you would find, let's say, in SQL with select top specific amount of records.
Samuel, there's a couple questions that were put inadvertently in chat. So let me just read those for you so you don't have to search for them. Adam asked, I have a question. Is it possible through a REST API insert to insert attachments as well? So can you insert an attachment? And if you can do it, can you give an example?
Is it possible to insert attachment? Well, I did cover this, so I think if you have any more questions, how do you call actions? I did cover that a bit earlier, so I'm unsure if he arrived a bit later. I can quickly do it again. Like, for example, I had created, no, I had created myself another, if I can find it. This one, not this one, not this one. Okay, I have created myself this specific sales order. So if we quickly go and take a look at it again, we have this sales order right here with these document details. If we go back to the execute the action create shipment, we have our basic URL, the entity keyword, the name of the endpoint, the version of the endpoint, the name of the entity, the name of the action. And in here, we can use the ID field, or we can also use the order number, the key field. So for in this case, since I'm using the ID, let me just retrieve it. Okay, so I have the ID right here. If I go back to my action, change my ID here, and send this. we have the 202 accepted, which means that the action is being now processed. I think the action does not take too long, so if we reset this, we can see that now it is in the status shipping and has a shipment being created. Can we see? If you have any more questions, okay, please feel free to ask them.
Well, I think that's it. If individuals have other questions they didn't think about until after the presentation, feel free to email me at mfranks@acumatica.com, mfranks@acumatica.com, and I'll direct your questions and make sure that they're answered.
Another question has been asked.
Yep. Yeah, Diane.
If the action takes a long time to process, is there a way to check for process status like in process? Yes, there is. So for example, if I go back to my post request that triggered, we got the 202 accepted, which means that the request was accepted. And in the headers of the response, we have a location to which we can, if we use it in a GET request, we will see the status here that if it's still in a 202 accepted, it means that it is still in process. If it is the 204 no content, it means that it has completed successfully. And well, if you see an error code with an error message, well, it unfortunately did not process successfully. But that is the way to get the status of the action.
Great. Well, I think that wraps it up then. Appreciate the presentation. Thank you, Samuel. Did a great job.